Christine Ross had no idea that February 2nd, 2009, would be the day she'd stumble upon one of the most chilling crime scenes in New Mexico history. The morning air was crisp in Albuquerque's West Mesa, that sprawling stretch of high desert that separates the city from the volcanoes, rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. Christine was doing what she'd done countless times before, walking her dog along the arroyos and dirt paths that crisscrossed this desolate landscape. Her dog, restless and curious, began digging frantically at something buried in the sandy soil. Christine called to the animal, but its determination was unshakable. As she approached, her eyes caught something that didn't belong in the desert's natural palette, something white, partially exposed by her dog's excavation. At first glance, it looked like the remnants of an animal carcass, perhaps a deer or elk that had wandered down from the Sandia Mountains. But as Christine knelt closer, the terrible truth began to crystallize. The white object wasn't bone from wildlife. It was human remains, a femur, weathered by years of desert winds and scorching summer heat. Christine's hands trembled as she reached for her cell phone. The gravity of her discovery sent shockwaves through her body. She was standing in what would soon be revealed as one of the largest crime scenes in Albuquerque's history, a makeshift cemetery where a killer had systematically disposed of his victims across several years. The 911 call came in at 10:47 a.m. Within 30 minutes, the West Mesa was swarming with police cars, their red and blue lights cutting through the desert's muted browns and grays. Detective Paul Feist was among the first investigators to arrive, and what he saw that morning would haunt him for years to come. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The initial excavation revealed more than anyone had anticipated. What began as the discovery of a single set of remains quickly evolved into something far more sinister. As crime scene technicians carefully brushed away layers of sand and debris, additional bones emerged. Then more, and more. The desert had been concealing its secrets for years, but now, under the methodical work of forensic experts, those secrets were finally coming to light. Each new discovery painted a darker picture of what had transpired in this remote location. The killer hadn't just disposed of one victim here. This was a dumping ground, a place where multiple lives had been reduced to scattered remains in shallow graves. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, casting harsh shadows across the crime scene, investigators realized they were dealing with something unprecedented in Albuquerque's criminal history. The meticulous placement of the remains suggested a killer who had intimate knowledge of the area, someone who understood the desert's rhythms and isolation. Detective Feist stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching as his team worked with archaeological precision. Each bone, each fragment of clothing, each piece of evidence was cataloged and photographed. The desert wind carried the sounds of distant traffic from the city below, a reminder that this horror had been unfolding just miles from where hundreds of thousands of people lived their daily lives, completely unaware of the graveyard hidden in the mesa. The investigation was just beginning, but already, the implications were staggering. How many victims were buried here? How long had this been going on? And most chilling of all, who was capable of such systematic killing? And were they still out there, hunting for their next victim? The excavation of the West Mesa burial site would take investigators nearly a month to complete, and with each passing day, the scope of the horror became more apparent. What Christine Ross had discovered wasn't just a single grave. It was a methodically organized killing field that had been in use for years. By the end of February 2009, forensic teams had unearthed the remains of 11 women, their bodies buried in shallow graves scattered across a 3-acre area. The killer had chosen his dumping ground with calculated precision. The West Mesa sits at an elevation of nearly 6,000 feet, a windswept plateau where the desert's harsh conditions would accelerate decomposition and scatter evidence. It was isolated enough to avoid casual discovery, yet accessible by vehicle, perfect for someone who needed to transport bodies under cover of darkness. Dr. Ross Zumwalt, New Mexico's chief medical investigator, arrived at the scene to oversee the delicate process of recovering and identifying the remains. What he found defied easy explanation. The victims had been buried at different times, spanning what appeared to be several years. Some remains were more recent, while others had been reduced to little more than bone fragments, by the desert's unforgiving environment. The positioning of the bodies told a disturbing story. Each victim had been placed in a similar manner, face down, buried in shallow graves dug just deep enough to conceal the remains from casual view. There was no attempt at dignity in death, no ritual or ceremony. These women had been discarded like refuse, their lives reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of efficiently. As forensic anthropologists worked to piece together the victims' identities, a pattern began to emerge. The remains showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, evidence that these women had been murdered before being transported to their desert grave. The killer wasn't just disposing of bodies. He was actively hunting and killing his victims before bringing them to this remote location. The crime scene yielded more than just human remains. Scattered among the graves, investigators found fragments of clothing, jewelry, and personal items that would prove crucial in identifying the victims. A turquoise bracelet here, a distinctive belt buckle there, small tokens of lives that had been violently cut short. Detective Paul Feist coordinated with missing persons databases across the region, knowing that somewhere, families were still waiting for answers about daughters, sisters, and mothers who had simply vanished without a trace. The desert had kept their secrets for years, but now those secrets were finally being exposed to the harsh light of investigation. The media attention was immediate and intense. News crews from across the country descended on Albuquerque, drawn by the magnitude of the discovery. The West Mesa Bone Collector, as the killer would come to be known, had created one of the largest crime scenes in New Mexico's history. Local residents were gripped by a mixture of fascination and fear. Fascination at the scale of the investigation unfolding in their backyard, and fear that a serial killer might still be prowling their streets. The excavation site became a carefully controlled archaeological dig, with each grid section meticulously searched and documented. Crime scene technicians used brushes and small tools, typically associated with paleontological digs, treating each potential piece of evidence with the reverence it deserved. The desert wind constantly threatened to scatter loose soil and debris, forcing investigators to work quickly while maintaining absolute precision. As February turned to March, the full scope of the killer's activities became clear. 11 women, ranging in age from their teens to their 30s, had been systematically murdered and dumped in this desolate location. Their killer had operated with impunity for years, confident that the desert would keep his secrets buried forever. But the desert had finally betrayed him, and now the race was on to identify not just his victims, but the monster who had stolen their lives and left them in unmarked graves beneath the endless New Mexico sky. The sterile walls of the office of the medical investigator became a place of both scientific discovery and profound heartbreak, as Dr. Ross Zumwalt and his team worked to restore names and stories to the 11 sets of remains recovered from the West Mesa. Each victim represented a life brutally interrupted, a family left with questions that had haunted them for years. The first identification came through dental records. Michelle Valdez, just 22 years old when she vanished in October 2004, had been missing for over 4 years when her remains were discovered. Michelle was a mother, her young daughter left to grow up wondering what had happened to the woman who had given her life. The dental records were a perfect match, and suddenly, Michelle's family had the answer they had been dreading, but at least they had an answer. Virginia Cloven was identified next. At 24, she had disappeared in April 2004, leaving behind a family who had never stopped searching. Virginia's mother, Ida Lopez, had spent years distributing flyers, pleading with anyone who would listen for information about her daughter's whereabouts. The call from investigators confirming Virginia's identity was both devastating and, in its own way, relief. The not knowing had been its own special kind of torture. Julie Nieto was 24 when she vanished in October 2003. Her identification through DNA analysis brought closure to a family that had been living in limbo for over 5 years. Julie's sister described her as vibrant and full of life, someone who lit up every room she entered. That light had been extinguished by a killer who saw these women as nothing more than disposable objects. As more identifications were confirmed, a troubling pattern emerged. Many of the victims had been involved in sex work, operating along Albuquerque's Central Avenue corridor, the historic Route 66 that cuts through the heart of the city. This wasn't coincidence, it was selection. The killer had specifically targeted women from a vulnerable population, women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive police investigations. Veronica Romero, just 28 when she disappeared, had been trying to turn her life around. She had enrolled in job training programs and was working to overcome addiction. Her family described a woman who was fighting to create a better future for herself, but that future was stolen before she could achieve it. Cinnamon Elks was the youngest victim identified, just 15 years old, when she vanished in September 2004. The discovery that a child had been among the killer's victims sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Cinnamon had been a runaway, living on Albuquerque streets and trying to survive in a world that offered few protections for vulnerable teenagers. The identification process was painstaking and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Each positive identification meant another family receiving the worst possible news, but it also meant another step toward justice. DNA analysis, dental records, and identifying characteristics slowly pieced together the identities of women who had been reduced to scattered bones in desert graves. Doreen Marquez, 36, had been missing since February 2005. Her family described her as a devoted mother who had struggled with addiction but never stopped loving her children. Her disappearance had left a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. Gina Valdez, just 22, disappeared in September 2004. Her family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Gina had been pregnant when she vanished, making her killer responsible for 2 deaths. The desert had claimed not just Gina's life, but the life of her unborn child as well. As spring 2009 progressed, investigators worked with forensic artists to create facial reconstructions for the victims, whose identities remained unknown. These haunting images, based on skull measurements and tissue depth calculations, were released to the public in hopes that someone would recognize a missing daughter, sister, or friend. The human cost of the West Mesa murders extended far beyond the 11 victims. Families had been shattered by years of uncertainty. Children had grown up without mothers, and an entire community had been living unknowingly in the shadow of a serial killer who hunted the most vulnerable members of society. The forensic evidence emerging from the West Mesa investigation painted a chilling portrait of a methodical predator who had refined his killing technique over several years. Dr. Ross Zumwalt's examination of the remains revealed disturbing consistencies that spoke to a killer operating with calculated precision rather than random violence. Each victim had suffered similar patterns of trauma, blunt force injuries to the skull that suggested the use of a heavy object as a murder weapon. The positioning of the fractures indicated attacks from behind, suggesting the killer had either surprised his victims or gained their trust before striking. This wasn't the frenzied violence of a disorganized killer. This was the work of someone who had developed a system and stuck to it. The burial pattern told an equally disturbing story. Each grave had been dug to approximately the same depth, just deep enough to conceal the remains from casual observation, but shallow enough to minimize the killer's time and effort at the burial site. The graves were oriented in similar directions, and the spacing between them suggested someone who had intimate knowledge of the terrain and had planned the layout of his desert cemetery. Crime scene analysts studying the West Mesa site determined that the killer had been using this location as his dumping ground for at least 5 years, possibly longer. The earliest disappearance that could be definitively linked to the site was Julie Nieto in October 2003, but investigators suspected there might have been earlier victims whose remains had been scattered by desert animals or whose cases had never been reported to police. The killer's victim selection revealed a predator who understood vulnerability and exploitation. By targeting women involved in sex work along Central Avenue, he had chosen victims from a population that society often overlooked. These women's disappearances might not trigger immediate intensive investigations, giving the killer time to operate without scrutiny. He understood the social dynamics that would work in his favor and exploited them ruthlessly. Geographic profiling analysis suggested the killer lived or worked in the Albuquerque area and had regular access to the West Mesa. The burial site wasn't visible from any major roads, requiring someone familiar with the desert's geography to navigate there repeatedly in darkness. This wasn't a location someone would stumble upon. It was a destination chosen through careful reconnaissance. The logistics of transporting 11 bodies to the burial site without detection required significant planning and resources. The killer needed access to a vehicle capable of navigating desert terrain, knowledge of the area's traffic patterns to avoid detection, and the physical capability to dig graves and move bodies across uneven ground. This pointed to someone with local knowledge, physical strength, and the ability to operate undetected over an extended period. FBI behavioral analysts studying the case identified several key characteristics of the West Mesa Killer. The methodical nature of the crimes suggested someone who planned carefully and stuck to established patterns. The victim selection indicated someone comfortable navigating Albuquerque's street culture and able to gain the trust of vulnerable women. The burial methodology revealed a killer who prioritized efficiency over ritual, someone for whom murder was a means to an end rather than the primary source of gratification. The time span of the killings, from 2003 through at least 2005, indicated either that the killer had moved away from the area, been incarcerated for other crimes, or died. The gap between the last known victim and the discovery of the remains in 2009 suggested that the killing spree had ended abruptly, which often occurs when serial killers are removed from circulation through arrest, imprisonment, or death. Perhaps most chilling was the evidence that suggested the killer had continued to visit the burial site even after completing his disposal activities. Tire tracks and foot impressions found during the excavation indicated recent activity at the site, raising the terrifying possibility that the killer had been returning to revisit his victims' remains, treating the desert graveyard as some kind of macabre trophy collection. The forensic evidence was building a profile of a calculating predator who had turned murder into a systematic process. But identifying this ghost would require investigators to dive deep into Albuquerque's underworld and uncover connections that the killer thought would remain buried forever beneath the desert sand. The neon lights of Central Avenue cast harsh shadows across Albuquerque's most dangerous corridor, where desperation and predation intersected in a deadly dance that had claimed 11 lives. To understand the West Mesa Killer's hunting ground, investigators had to immerse themselves in a world that most of society preferred to ignore, the brutal reality of street-level sex work in a city where survival often meant accepting unthinkable risks. Central Avenue, the storied Route 66 that once carried travelers across America, had evolved into something far darker by the early 2000s. The stretch between downtown Albuquerque and the fairgrounds became a marketplace where vulnerability was currency and trust could be fatal. Women working these streets operated in a legal gray area that offered no protection from violence, no recourse when clients turned predatory, and no safety net when they simply disappeared. Detective Paul Feist began conducting interviews with women who had survived these streets during the killer's active period. Their stories painted a picture of a community under siege, where whispered warnings were passed between workers about dangerous clients, suspicious vehicles, and men who asked too many questions or made unusual requests. The women had developed their own informal network of protection, but it hadn't been enough to save 11 of their number. Maria Santos had worked Central Avenue during 2004 and 2005, the peak years of the West Mesa Killer's activity. She remembered the growing sense of unease as women began disappearing with increasing frequency. "We'd see girls one night, and then they'd just be gone," she told investigators. "At first, you'd think maybe they got arrested, or maybe they moved to another city. But when it kept happening, we knew something was wrong." The women developed strategies to protect themselves, working in pairs when possible, noting license plate numbers of suspicious vehicles, and establishing check-in systems with friends. But their clientele often consisted of men who specifically sought out isolated, vulnerable women, and the killer had exploited this dynamic perfectly. Investigators discovered that the West Mesa victims had all been working the same general area of Central Avenue, a stretch that included several motels, bars, and truck stops that catered to the sex trade. The killer would have blended seamlessly into this environment, appearing to be just another client seeking services. His ability to gain the victim's trust suggested he was familiar with the protocols and expectations of these transactions. The economic desperation that drove women to work these dangerous streets created perfect hunting conditions for a predator. Many of the victims struggled with addiction, had children to support, or were trapped in cycles of poverty that left them few alternatives. They couldn't afford to be selective about clients, and the killer understood this vulnerability intimately. Carmen Rodriguez, who had been friends with several of the victims, described the atmosphere of fear that permeated the Central Avenue corridor during the killer's active period. "You'd get in a car with someone, and you never knew if you were going to come back," she recalled. "But what choice did we have? We needed the money to survive, to feed our kids, to get through another day." The killer's method of approach remained consistent according to witness accounts. He would cruise the area in what appeared to be a sedan or small pickup truck, engaging potential victims in conversation before negotiating services. Several witnesses remembered seeing some of the victims getting into vehicles matching similar descriptions, but the darkness and their focus on their own survival meant few had gotten clear looks at either the vehicle or the driver. The investigation revealed that the killer had been hunting in an environment where violence was already commonplace, where women routinely faced threats from aggressive clients, abusive partners, and dangerous working conditions. His crimes had occurred against a backdrop of systemic violence that made it easier for his activities to go undetected. As investigators mapped the victims' last known movements, a geographic pattern emerged. All 11 women had been working within a concentrated area of Central Avenue, and several had been seen in the same locations on the nights they disappeared. The killer wasn't casting a wide net. He was fishing in a very specific pond where he knew the most vulnerable prey would be found. The investigation into the West Mesa murders represented a collision between old-fashioned detective work and cutting-edge forensic technology. While the killer had operated in a world of cash transactions and anonymous encounters, he had left behind digital traces that would prove crucial in building the case against him. Cell phone tower data became one of the most valuable tools in the investigation. By 2004 and 2005, cell phone usage was widespread, and even the most careful criminals often carried phones without considering how their devices constantly communicated with nearby towers. Investigators obtained warrants for cell tower records covering the Central Avenue corridor during the time periods when the victims had disappeared. The data revealed fascinating patterns. Several phones had repeatedly appeared in the same geographic areas, at times corresponding to the victims' disappearances. While this information alone wasn't enough to identify a suspect, it provided investigators with a digital footprint that could be cross-referenced with other evidence. Detective Paul Feist worked closely with FBI digital forensics specialists to analyze financial records from businesses along Central Avenue. ATM transactions, credit card purchases, and even parking meter payments created a paper trail that could place potential suspects in the area during critical time periods. The killer might have thought he was operating in a cash-only world, but digital payments were becoming increasingly common even for small transactions. Surveillance camera technology was still relatively primitive in the mid-2000s, but investigators managed to recover footage from several businesses along Central Avenue. The grainy, black and white images required enhancement and careful analysis, but they provided glimpses of vehicles and individuals in the area during the relevant time periods. While most of the footage was too poor quality to identify specific individuals, it helped establish patterns of movement and narrow the investigation's focus. The forensic examination of the victims remains yielded unexpected digital evidence. Several victims had been carrying cell phones when they disappeared, and while the devices themselves had long since been destroyed by the desert environment, investigators were able to obtain detailed records of their final calls and text messages. These communications painted a picture of the victims' last hours and, in some cases, provided clues about who they might have encountered. Michelle Valdez's phone records showed a series of calls to known associates on the night she disappeared, followed by an abrupt cessation of all communication. The timing of her final outgoing call helped investigators narrow the window when she had encountered her killer. Similar patterns emerged from other victims' phone records, creating a timeline that would prove crucial in identifying suspects. Computer forensics played an increasingly important role as investigators expanded their search beyond the immediate crime scene. They began examining online classified advertisements, early social media platforms, and digital communication records that might connect the victims to potential suspects. The internet was creating new hunting grounds for predators, and investigators had to learn to navigate this digital landscape. The breakthrough came when investigators began cross-referencing multiple data sources simultaneously. Cell tower records, financial transactions, surveillance footage, and phone records were fed into analytical software that could identify patterns invisible to human investigators. This approach revealed several individuals who had been in the right places at the right times with suspicious frequency. One name began appearing with increasing regularity across multiple data sets. The individual had made ATM withdrawals near Central Avenue on nights when several victims had disappeared, had cell phone activity consistent with cruising the area where the women worked, and had purchased gasoline at stations along routes leading to the West Mesa burial site. The digital evidence was circumstantial but compelling. It painted a picture of someone who had been systematically hunting in the Central Avenue corridor and had intimate knowledge of the routes leading to the desert burial ground. While the technology of the mid-2000s hadn't captured the killer in the act, it had created a digital shadow that investigators could follow back to its source. As the investigation progressed into 2009 and beyond, advances in digital forensics provided new tools for analyzing old evidence. Enhanced image processing revealed details and surveillance footage that had been invisible during the initial investigation. Improved data analysis software identified connections that earlier techniques had missed. The killer had operated in an analog world, but lived in an increasingly digital one, and that contradiction would ultimately provide the key to unraveling his carefully constructed anonymity. The convergence of digital evidence, witness statements, and forensic analysis led investigators to focus their attention on one individual who had emerged from the shadows of the investigation, like a specter materializing from the desert itself. Lorenzo Montoya, a 52-year-old Albuquerque resident, became the prime suspect in the West Mesa murders, and his background painted a disturbing portrait of a man whose life had been building toward the violence discovered in the desert. Montoya's criminal history read like a blueprint for escalating predatory behavior. His first arrest came in the early 1980s for solicitation, marking the beginning of a documented pattern of interactions with sex workers along Central Avenue. Over the following decades, his charges had grown progressively more serious: assault, battery, and threatening behavior toward women in the very community where the West Mesa victims had worked and died. Detective Paul Feist's investigation revealed that Montoya had lived just miles from both the Central Avenue corridor and the West Mesa burial site. His apartment complex sat at the intersection of these two crucial locations, providing him with intimate knowledge of both the hunting ground and the disposal site. More significantly, Montoya had worked in construction and landscaping, occupations that gave him access to vehicles capable of desert travel and the tools necessary for digging graves. The timeline of Montoya's life aligned disturbingly well with the pattern of disappearances. Witnesses from the Central Avenue area identified him as someone who had been a regular presence during the years when the victims vanished. Several sex workers recalled encounters with a man matching Montoya's description who had made them uncomfortable with his aggressive behavior and unusual requests. Maria Santos, one of the surviving women from Central Avenue, provided investigators with a chilling account of her encounter with Montoya in late 2004. "He picked me up near the Crossroads Motel," she recalled. "Something about him felt wrong from the beginning. He kept asking strange questions about whether anyone knew where I was, if anyone would miss me if I disappeared. I made him let me out before we got to wherever he was taking me." Physical evidence began linking Montoya to the crimes. Soil samples from his vehicles matched the distinctive mineral composition of the West Mesa burial site. His work schedule showed him frequently traveling routes that passed near the desert location where the bodies were discovered. Most damning, his cell phone records placed him in the Central Avenue area during the time windows when several victims had disappeared. The psychological profile that emerged from interviews with Montoya's associates painted a picture of a man consumed by rage toward women, particularly those involved in sex work. Former co-workers described him as someone who spoke about sex workers with contempt and dehumanizing language, viewing them as disposable objects rather than human beings. This attitude aligned perfectly with the methodical, impersonal nature of the West Mesa murders. Montoya's living situation provided further insight into his capacity for the crimes. He lived alone in a ground-floor apartment with easy access to parking, allowing him to come and go at unusual hours without attracting attention. His neighbors described him as someone who kept odd hours and was often absent for extended periods, particularly during the time frame when the murders were occurring. The investigation revealed that Montoya had extensive knowledge of the West Mesa area, having worked construction jobs throughout the region for over 2 decades. He understood the terrain, knew which areas were rarely patrolled, and had the experience to navigate the desert roads even in darkness. This familiarity was crucial to the killer's ability to repeatedly transport bodies to the burial site without detection. Financial records showed that Montoya had regularly withdrawn cash from ATMs near Central Avenue during evening hours, consistent with someone trolling for victims in the sex trade. His purchases of gasoline, rope, and cleaning supplies created a paper trail that aligned with the logistics required for serial murder and body disposal. As investigators built their case against Montoya, they discovered that he had exhibited increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the discovery of the bodies. Co-workers reported that he had become more aggressive and paranoid, making comments about police surveillance and expressing fears about being arrested for unspecified crimes. The evidence against Lorenzo Montoya was mounting into a compelling case that would finally bring justice for the 11 women whose lives had been stolen and whose bodies had been abandoned in the desert. But justice, as investigators would soon discover, can be as elusive as the desert winds that had scattered evidence across the West Mesa for years. The execution of the search warrant at Lorenzo Montoya's residence on December 1, 2009, marked the culmination of months of painstaking investigation. As Detective Paul Feist and his team approached the modest apartment complex on Albuquerque's west side, they carried with them the hopes of 11 families who had waited years for answers about their missing daughters, sisters, and mothers. Montoya's ground-floor apartment sat in a complex that had seen better days, its stucco walls weathered by decades of New Mexico sun and wind. The location was strategic, close enough to Central Avenue for easy access to the hunting ground, yet far enough away to avoid the scrutiny that came with living directly in the area where the victims had worked and disappeared. The initial entry revealed an environment that spoke to a man living on society's margins. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with little in the way of personal belongings or decorative touches. But it was what investigators found hidden throughout the residence that would provide the most damning evidence against the suspected West Mesa killer. In Montoya's bedroom closet, wrapped in plastic bags and hidden behind old clothing, investigators discovered a collection of women's jewelry and personal items that would prove to be trophies from his victims. A turquoise bracelet that Michelle Valdez's family immediately recognized. A distinctive silver ring that had belonged to Virginia Cloven. Small, intimate items that the killer had kept as reminders of his crimes. The garage attached to Montoya's apartment contained even more disturbing evidence. Investigators found shovels with traces of West Mesa soil still clinging to their blades, rope that matched fibers found at the burial site, cleaning supplies that suggested an attempt to eliminate forensic evidence from vehicles used to transport the bodies. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of detailed maps of the Central Avenue corridor and the West Mesa area. Montoya had marked specific locations along the route between the two areas, creating what amounted to a hunter's guide to the terrain where he had stalked his prey. The maps showed an intimate knowledge of back roads, isolated areas, and routes that would allow someone to move undetected between the city and the desert. In a bedroom drawer, investigators found a collection of newspaper clippings about missing women from the Central Avenue area. Montoya had been following the cases closely, keeping track of which disappearances had attracted police attention and which had been relegated to back-page mentions. The clippings revealed a killer who was acutely aware of how society valued, or failed to value, the lives of his victims. The forensic examination of Montoya's vehicles provided additional evidence linking him to the crimes. His pickup truck contained trace amounts of blood that would later be matched through DNA analysis to several of the West Mesa victims. Soil samples from the truck's tires and undercarriage contained minerals consistent with the burial site, and fiber evidence connected the vehicle to clothing fragments found with the remains. Computer analysis revealed another layer to Montoya's criminal activities. His internet search history showed repeated queries about police investigative techniques, body decomposition rates in desert environments, and methods for avoiding detection during criminal activities. He had been researching how to be a more effective killer, studying the science of death and disposal with the dedication of a graduate student. More disturbing still were the digital photographs found on Montoya's computer, images of women who appeared to be unconscious or deceased, taken in locations that matched the description of his apartment and vehicle. While the quality of the images made positive identification difficult, several appeared to show women who had been reported missing from the Central Avenue area during the killer's active period. The search also revealed evidence that Montoya had been planning additional crimes. Investigators found detailed surveillance notes about other women working the Central Avenue corridor, including their schedules, preferred locations, and apparent vulnerabilities. The killer hadn't been finished with his spree. He had simply been interrupted by circumstances that had forced him to lay low. In a metal box hidden beneath loose floorboards, investigators made perhaps their most significant discovery, a handwritten journal in which Montoya had recorded detailed accounts of his crimes. The entries were clinical in their description of the murders, devoid of emotion or remorse, reading more like a mechanic's log of routine maintenance than the confession of a serial killer. The evidence found in Montoya's residence painted a picture of a methodical predator who had turned murder into a systematic enterprise. But as investigators would soon discover, the House of Secrets would never yield its final testimony in a court of law. The morning of December 2nd, 2009, dawned gray and cold across Albuquerque as Detective Paul Feist prepared to arrest Lorenzo Montoya for the West Mesa murders. The evidence gathered from the previous day's search had provided investigators with what they believed was sufficient probable cause to charge Montoya with multiple counts of first-degree murder. 11 families were about to receive the news they had waited years to hear, that the man responsible for their loved ones' deaths would finally face justice. But justice, like the desert wind that had scattered evidence across the West Mesa for years, can shift direction without warning. At 6:47 a.m., patrol officers dispatched to arrest Montoya at his workplace found something that would change the entire trajectory of the case. Lorenzo Montoya was dead, his body discovered in his apartment by a concerned neighbor who had noticed his failure to show up for work and the unusual smell emanating from his residence. The initial assessment suggested suicide. Montoya had apparently ingested a lethal combination of prescription medications sometime during the night, following the search of his residence. On his kitchen table, investigators found a rambling, incoherent note that seemed to acknowledge guilt while stopping short of explicit confession. The timing was no coincidence. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of arrest, Montoya had chosen to end his life rather than face trial. The discovery of Montoya's body sent shockwaves through the investigation team and the families of the victims. Detective Feist stood in the same apartment where, just 24 hours earlier, his team had uncovered evidence that would have put Montoya away for life. Now, instead of preparing for an arrest that would bring closure to 11 grieving families, he was staring at another body in what had become New Mexico's most complex serial murder case. Dr. Ross Zumwalt, who had spent months examining the remains of Montoya's victims, now found himself conducting an autopsy on the suspected killer. The toxicology results confirmed what investigators had suspected. Montoya had consumed enough prescription medication to kill himself several times over. The timing and method suggested a man who had accepted his fate and chosen to control the circumstances of his death. The suicide note, while rambling and at times incoherent, contained passages that investigators interpreted as admissions of guilt. Montoya wrote about the weight of what I've done and referenced the women who haunt my dreams. While he never explicitly confessed to the West Mesa murders, the language suggested someone tormented by memories of violent acts. For the families of the victims, Montoya's death represented both vindication and frustration. They finally had an answer to the question that had consumed their lives for years, but they would never see their loved one's killer face trial. There would be no opportunity to confront him in court, no chance to hear him admit his guilt publicly, no formal legal resolution to their years of anguish. Michelle Valdez's mother, Kathy, spoke for many of the families when she told reporters, "Part of me is glad he's dead because he can't hurt anyone else. But part of me wanted to look him in the eye and ask him why he took my baby girl from me. The investigation didn't end with Montoya's death, but it fundamentally changed direction. Without a living suspect to prosecute, investigators focused on building the strongest possible case that would conclusively link Montoya to all 11 murders. The families deserved definitive answers, even if those answers would never be tested in a court of law. DNA evidence from the crime scenes was compared against samples taken from Montoya's body during autopsy. The results provided strong circumstantial links between the suspect and several of the victims, though the degraded condition of the desert remains limited the forensic evidence available for comparison. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit conducted a posthumous psychological evaluation of Montoya based on the evidence gathered during the investigation. Their profile concluded that he matched the characteristics of the West Mesa Killer in virtually every significant category: demographics, criminal history, geographic knowledge, and psychological makeup. As 2009 drew to a close, investigators reached the conclusion that Lorenzo Montoya had been responsible for the West Mesa murders. While they would never be able to present their case to a jury, the evidence against him was compelling enough to provide closure to the families and the community that had lived in fear of a serial killer for years. But even in death, Montoya had managed to deny his victims one final measure of justice: the public acknowledgement of his guilt and the formal legal resolution that comes with a criminal conviction. The wind still blows across the West Mesa today, carrying with it the echoes of 11 lives that were cut brutally short and the whispered questions that may never be fully answered. More than 15 years have passed since Christine Ross and her dog made their horrific discovery in the desert. Yet the impact of the West Mesa murders continues to reverberate through Albuquerque and beyond. The families of the victims have found different ways to cope with the complex legacy of Lorenzo Montoya's crimes and his suicide. Some have achieved a measure of peace, accepting that while they may never have had their day in court, justice took its own form when Montoya chose death over facing the consequences of his actions. Others remain tormented by unanswered questions and the knowledge that their loved one's killer would never publicly acknowledge his guilt or explain his motivations. Michelle Valdez's daughter grew up knowing that her mother had been murdered, but also knowing that the man responsible could never hurt anyone else. The family established a scholarship in Michelle's name, ensuring that her memory would be associated with hope and opportunity rather than just tragedy. Michelle would have wanted something good to come from this, her mother Kathy explained. She would have wanted to help other young women find better paths. The Central Avenue corridor where Montoya hunted his victims has undergone significant changes in the years since the murders. Increased police patrols, improved lighting, and social services programs have made the area somewhat safer, though the fundamental vulnerabilities that made the West Mesa victims easy targets persist throughout society. Sex work remains dangerous, marginalized women continue to face violence, and predators still prowl the edges of communities looking for victims society won't miss. Detective Paul Feist, now retired from the Albuquerque Police Department, reflects on the case as both a professional success and a personal burden. "We solved the case," he says, "but solving isn't the same as resolving." Those families deserve their day in court, deserve to hear him admit what he did. Instead, he took the coward's way out and left us all with questions we'll never be able to answer. The West Mesa burial site itself has become an unofficial memorial. Families of the victims sometimes visit the remote location, leaving flowers, photographs, and personal mementos among the desert scrub where their loved ones' remains were discovered. The city of Albuquerque has resisted efforts to create a formal memorial at the site, citing concerns about accessibility and maintenance, but the desert itself has become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to honor the dead. Forensic advances in the years since Montoya's death have provided additional confirmation of his guilt. Improved DNA analysis techniques have strengthened the links between the suspect and several victims, while enhanced computer forensics have revealed additional evidence on his digital devices. Each new piece of evidence adds weight to the conclusion that Montoya was indeed the West Mesa Killer, but also serves as a reminder of what might have been proven in court had he lived to stand trial. The case has become a study subject in law enforcement academies across the country, used to train investigators in serial murder cases and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. The West Mesa murders demonstrated both the power of modern forensic techniques and the limitations that exist when killers target society's most marginalized members. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the West Mesa murders has been the conversations they sparked about how society treats its most vulnerable members. The victims were not nameless statistics. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives had value beyond the circumstances that led them to Central Avenue. Their deaths forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty, addiction, and the violence that thrives in society's shadows. The 11 women whose remains were discovered in the desert had dreams that were never realized, children who grew up without mothers, and families who loved them despite the dangers they faced. Michelle Valdez wanted to be a nurse. Virginia Cloven was trying to get clean and rebuild her relationship with her family. Julie Nieto had plans to move away from Albuquerque and start fresh somewhere else. These dreams died with them in the desert, but their memories live on in the people who knew them, the investigators who fought for justice on their behalf, and the community that learned to see them as more than just victims of violence. The West Mesa will always be marked by the tragedy that unfolded there, but it has also become a testament to the persistence of those who refuse to let the dead be forgotten. 11 voices still call out from the desert, demanding that we remember not just how they died, but how they lived, and that we work to ensure their fate doesn't befall others who find themselves walking society's most dangerous margins. In the end, the West Mesa Bone Collector claimed 11 lives, but he could not claim their humanity, their dignity, or their right to be remembered as more than just entries in a case file. That may be the most important justice of all.